Welcome to Pervasive Media Studio. Welcome to the Lunchtime Talk this week. I'm sorry for the slight delay in start there. We had a small technical issue with the stream, but we've managed to resolve it now. So these talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online. So whether you're in Bristol or far away, you can join in the conversation. My name's Vic. I'm Talent Development Lead at Watershed. I'm based in the studio, but I also work across our film programmes too. I am a white woman with short brown hair, wearing a denim jacket and yellow skirt. Every Friday we open the doors of Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend time in the space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. An especially big welcome to those who are new to the studio, for whom this may be the first time you're engaging with us. Welcome if this is your first time today. So what is Pervasive Media Studio? We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. The studio is a partnership between Watershed, University of the West of England and the University of Bristol, and it's funded by Arts Council England. We offer studio space, which is desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. We're also a space for people to take risks with early ideas and make time for collaboration. So quick bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Please feel free to move around, make a cup of tea or grab a glass of water if you need to. We've got a quiet space which is just to the left here, just through that door. Please feel free to make use of that if you need to take a break at any point. Fire exits are at either end of the studio that way, and one of the studio team will direct you there if we need to use them. We've got accessible toilets and baby change in the corridor next to the kitchen, just over there as well. There's a Q&A at the end of the talk. For those of you that are watching online, if you pop your questions in the chat, Emma, who's sitting at the back here, will be your voice in the room today. And if you're in the room with us, you can just raise your hand, because hopefully everyone will have lots and lots of questions for Jazz today. You can get news on future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, at Pervasive Media Studio on Mastodon, at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. So, our speaker today is Jasmine Butt. Jazz is a musician, synth builder, AV artist, and studio resident. She's recently started a PhD at UE looking at optical sound, a way of recording audio waves as fluctuations of light on photographic film. Today, she's going to talk about the history of the technique and some of her own experiments in converting the moving image to sound and developing digital tools to extend the optical sound framework. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jasmine.
Hello, everyone. So we've had a few AV issues today, and we're going to be getting audio through the TV, which is picked up through my mic. So apparently the mic's quite hot, and I apologize for any nervous gurgling or like stressed mouth sounds that you might hear. So I'm here to talk about optical sound. I'll explain what it is and how it works a bit later. And after going through some of its history, I'd also like to talk a bit about my own practice and the beginnings of my research around optical sound and instrument design at UE. So since learning about optical sound, I've recently become quite interested in its origins, and I started to read around some of the inventions that led up to it. And the more reading I did, the less clear-cut this history seemed. So it's kind of a massive and sprawling techno history, and today I'm presenting quite a scattered list of inventions, which is mostly chronological, but not always chronological, and I'm kind of folding in a few ideas and themes that have become thinking points in my own work. And I'm not a historian or a philosopher, so it's quite a light touch look into this history, I have to say that, because I know there's probably some experts in the room as well. So I had to leave out quite a lot of inventions, and the slides might be a bit chaotic, but I can share references with anyone who's interested to find out more at the end. Good. So this realization that technological history is very messy and confusing relates directly to the subject of media archaeology, which I only found out about relatively recently. Reading books by Jussi Parekka and Erkki Hutamo. They've been writing sort of the main textbooks on the subject, and I really recommend, if you're interested, reading those. Media archaeology is a term that's still taking shape from its use, and it's used in a few different contexts. Lots of creatives use media archaeology as an art method, and in this case, I'm using it as a way to think about design. So it's a process of looking at media, which could be anything. It's not necessarily technical objects. And the things that we're born into the world surrounded by. It explores the way that we engage with media and machines as systems, and the way that that engagement shapes how we think and what we output into the world, which kind of creates a feedback loop through the generations. It can be a process of looking at what mechanisms of power and control have determined what media gets made and what media gets forgotten. Exploring why certain ideas disappear and then cycle back around periodically over time, which is why I included this sort of idea of virtual augmented reality with your Victorian stereoscopes, and then the 90s Virtual Boy, which was a complete flop, and sort of more modern explorations of virtual reality with the Mew Talk, which is like a soundproof booth for your face. Media archaeology asserts that media history is not necessarily neatly chronological, and it encourages us to look for neglected histories and genealogies of media. And it holds the idea that looking at the past can say more about us in the present than us in the past. Because when we look at obsolete or forgotten technologies, sometimes we have quite strong reactions to them. They can seem kind of fantastical or imaginary or otherworldly. And engaging with why we might have those reactions to past media is kind of an interesting thing to explore. Sometimes when you look at the technical story of an object, you start to understand it in a different way, as a series of choices that are based on circumstances that don't exist anymore. But for me personally, media archaeology is mostly about unboxing the black box and kind of exploring the material histories of technology, kind of opening up these very invisible systems and looking at the kind of like mechanical and visible and tangible histories of technology. And the closer you explore these kind of histories, the closer you get to communities of repair and hacking and circuit bending and repurposing of machines and technologies, which I think are communities that are really vital today. So I'll give an example of a very DIY material history that a lot of you might know about, which is the nip cow disc, which was invented in the 1880s. It was patented and named by Paul Nipkow in Germany in the 1880s, and it's a disc with equidistant holes cut in a spiral, and it rotates at really high speeds, so it was kind of a way of scanning an image and turning a 2D image or something visual into a one-dimensional signal. I'll explain it a little bit more with this slide. So this is quite a famous one. John Logie Baird cut his Nipkow discs out of a hat box in his mechanical TV in 1925. And basically he had an image. So for this one, he was using his dummy head, Stooky Bill, who's kind of terrifying. And he would spin these discs at incredibly high speeds with very kind of terrifying electrical motors that he got electrocuted by quite often. And he would, basically, the holes that were spinning would kind of scan this image of Stooky Bill probably from left to right and down, sort of rasterizing the image. And the light that was shining through at whichever place the holes were aligning with would then be read by a photoelectric cell, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And that was translated into electrical signals, sent to another spinning disk somewhere else, and it would kind of reform this image of Stooky Bill onto the back of a screen. And he built this mechanical TV out of, it's not in my notes now, but it's stuff like darning needles and pairs of scissors and just completely hacked together stuff, like old tea chests. So it's like a very physical origin of like a very sort of technical process that now is kind of feels like quite an immaterial and invisible process. The concept of this image being kind of destroyed, sent via wires, and then kind of reassembled somewhere else. So in the 1880s, the concept of the signal was relatively new. Don Ide, who's a philosopher of technology, described technology of having amplification reduction structure, which kind of makes sense to me because it's the idea of information being shrunk down into microscopic places and then spat out again, kind of like the magic school bus sort of type of thing. So it kind of feels appropriate that early experiments with sound could involve lenses and optics, this like very physical process of shrinking and magnifying. And him and his assistant developed this machine, the photophone, where he was using mirrors, very delicate sort of diaphragms of mirrors that would be shaken by sonic vibrations and kind of create these light signals that could then be amplified. And he kind of switched that process around as well to listen to the movement of the sun, of a cloud across the sun's disk. So he was setting up these sort of huge outdoor mirrors where he was sending light onto his, they're kind of the beginnings of solar energy sort of technology, using selenium and lamp black to kind of harvest the power of the sun, basically. And he was really interested in this idea that light had no mass, so it had no like mechanical, there wasn't much, it wasn't expensive mechanically, so he could sort of use light to send signals. And that's obviously kind of a precursor to the fiber optic technology that we have now. So I've got like a real interest in musical instruments and the history of musical instrument design. And the more I read about different electronic musical instruments, the more I realize that the history of them is really it's a very military history. The famous examples of this are the theremin and the vocoder, but even the saxophone was funded by the French military. And these were sort of technologies that were invented for kind of tuned for discretion and precision. One example of this was the thalified cell that was invented by Theodore Case. And it was a communication device between Navy ships. So he printed the word hello onto film in 1922 using this light communication technology, which worked by if you kind of spoke or sent a signal into like a sound into this reader here, it would kind of react with a gas to kind of modulate the strength of a flame, which would then be sent via lenses and mirrors to a reading device where he used this thalified cell. It's quite technical. I don't really understand exactly how it works. I think it uses selenium. But basically, it was a way of reading this light and translating it into electrical signals. So he was the person that first explored this idea that sound could be printed onto film. And another inventor was Lee De Forest, who came up with the Audion tube, which was the first effective amplifier and basically caused a kind of a technical explosion of radio and communication. So the methods of communication used with the triode or the Audion tube were never intended to be used by the public. It was initially used as a wireless telegram sort of device that was designed to keep signals out of reach and away from tampering by the public or by sort of unofficial people or enemy forces. So Leader Forrest was very worried about the radio chaos that would ensue if the general public had access to this technology, and he advised that the airwaves be heavily regulated. So it's interesting that these kinds of technologies, I mean, people weren't, that it wasn't being thought of that the public would ever be able to sort of communicate with each other and kind of take charge of the airwaves, which is why I've kind of included a picture of the pirate radio station Passion Radio from Bristol, if any of you know about it. But if you're interested in pirate radio, this was a photo I found from an amazing mixtape called Bristol Pirates by Death Is Not the End, which is worth looking at. So meanwhile in Hollywood, the film industry was having an awful time trying to sync sound with film. This is an example of one of the early attempts to synchronize a kind of a talking soundtrack or a musical soundtrack with 16 or 35mm film. It was developed at Bell Labs and bought by Warner Brothers, and it's a turntable that was synced up to the motor of a projector. So the issue was that often with projectors you'd have like lots of skipping with the film, like there might be an issue with the sprocket not quite aligning in the gate, so there'll be like this judder that projectionists are quite good at fixing by like giving it a quick tug, but they wouldn't be able to then sync the sound up because I think that the records were incredibly expensive and delicate, probably made of shellac, and you couldn't just go and like do like a nudge or nudge it back. There wasn't really that concept then of the beat matching or like the turntablism. So it was an absolute nightmare, and every time it was out of sync, basically the projectionist would have to start the whole film over again, and the record. And this is the palaphotophone. So a couple more inventions, then we're on to the optical sound. It's from the Greek shaking light sound, and it was developed by Charles A. Hoxsey and General Electric. So they were using this kind of idea of like a shaking aperture. So sound vibrations would shake an aperture and kind of direct light onto a film strip to be exposed. And these would kind of create these like wiggles and shapes of sound onto a film strip. And this is one of the first multi-track recording systems, and it was all optical. So I find that really interesting. So now we're on to movie tone, phonofilm, and the variable area soundtrack, which is phototone, developed by Hoxsey. And I'll just pass around some examples of optical sound. If you want to pass, you don't have to sort of hold it and pass it around. You can feel free to skip. So the names I mentioned before, Theodore Case, Leader Forrest, Theodore Case invented this sort of light reader, and Leader Forrest invented the Audion tube, or that kind of amplifier. They were working together for a while. They had lots and lots of disputes. It's all very messy history. There was also other people in Sweden who were kind of working in parallel with these types of inventions. So I'm not going to say who did what when, but the patented names were Movietone and Phonofilm. That was for this kind of variable density soundtrack along the side, which wasn't massively popular. This is the more popular one, but variable density basically just used a light fluctuations that would be exposed onto film as it moved through the camera. And then this phototone, which is the more commonly used one that's on both of these strips. That is basically the same as the palaphotophone, where it's kind of got this shaping aperture that kind of creates a wiggle soundtrack. And I'll just show you, hopefully this is in the right place. If not, I'll have to find it.
All right, now, give us that guitar again.
This is...
So picture of the guitar notes. Well, can you show us some other instrument?
So that's what the variable area sounds like. And yeah, so just a long strip of kind of fluctuating shapes and vibrations on the soundtrack strip. So after the invention of optical sound, there were tons of really interesting experiments happening kind of in a parallel way, usually, mainly between Russia and Germany in the 30s. The main players were Avramov and Jankowski, making ornamental sound, and also Oskar Fischinger in Germany. And there was so in the Central Laboratory of Wire Communication in Russia, there was like a really interesting multidisciplinary team of engineers and acoustic experts and animators and mathematicians all working together to kind of create these soundtracks and basically exploring kind of unheard tones, because synthesized music was relatively new. So it was like a case of complete exploration. These concepts of like wave shapes were relatively new as well. So they described it as creating new systems of harmony and new scales. And Fischinger said, between ornaments and music persists direct connections, which means that ornaments are music. So he's posing here with, I think apparently these are fake scrolls, because he didn't really want anyone else to know exactly how he was drawing his ornamental music. But there was, yeah, very similar kind of experiments happening in the two places. And hundreds of hours of ornamental sound films where Avramov's son had kind of his whole archive in his garage, I think, and his sons were making rockets from his films because it was really flammable, and they kind of destroyed the whole archive. So that's why I don't have the videos to show you, probably, of the ornamental sound. So in the early 30s, there was an animator called Voinov who used paper sound. So he was cutting out black card or white card and creating these combs. And he was working with drawn animation. So every stop frame he made, he would place these combs down the side. And he was experimenting with kind of making chords up from, he would cut out combs of sort of different frequencies and then layer them up. So he's kind of creating multi-tonal or sort of, multi-tonal music that way. And Sholpo, around a similar time, was working on the variophone, which is a really complicated instrument that I've stared at for ages, this diagram, and it's really hard to understand what's going on. But he was cutting out these paper discs with basically patterned holes on and using them, you can see here, to kind of expose these different shapes across the film. And again, it was like a polyphonic. He had, I think he was kind of exposing in multiple runs, so he would expose one frequency and then the next. But yeah, he was, he was sort of getting very, very technical with the technology in a way that's kind of takes it a little bit further back from a kind of intuitive understanding of it for me, but it's a very interesting invention. And then after the paper sound, so back to Avramov and Jankowski, after creating sound from images, they began to create images from sound. So they were kind of exploring the mathematics of speech and these kind of ideas of formants, which is like the kind of harmonic frequencies you would get in different complex sounds. So if you think of the human voice as having, you could have like a fundamental pitch if you sing, but it's the formants and these extra harmonics that kind of make you hear the sort of E's and O's and I sounds. So they were kind of exploring this mathematically and graphically. And they were using human calculators, who were often female mathematicians, with abacuses to calculate these formants and build up these kind of graphical pictures of sound, which was like just massively ahead of its time. And it's something that's been explored a lot recently in sort of digital audio processing, but it feels like knowing that this was happening in the 30s is kind of mind-blowing. And Jankowski said that nobody did this before the invention of graphical sound, just because there were no technical means and methodology for sound reproduction from such graphical representations of sound. So it was seeing and sort of working with sound in a visual and kind of a tangible way that kind of allowed it to become more technical, and for these kind of wave shapes to be explored in like a more complex way. So he was also talking about the color of sound. He said it's now important to conquer and increase the smoothness of tone, colors, flowing rainbows of spectral colors in sound, instead of monotonous coloring of stationary sounding fixed geometric figures or wave shapes. So it's this idea of like these kind of animations or metamorphosis of complex kind of shapes, rather than the kind of strict wave shapes that they were exploring before with ornamental sound. And I'll show you an example of my fixed wave shapes that's quite dull. So this was an experiment where I was just layering two sine waves over each other. But you know how in Photoshop you have blend modes? I was just experimenting with the ways that two sine waves, graphical, laid over each other. If you use different blend modes, then the frequencies are kind of interacting differently and showing these different wave shapes and tones. So what's happening here is the sound is being read from the top to the bottom of this image here, and it's kind of creating these sound waves. But as Jankowski said, the sort of static waveforms are really uninteresting, but it's the kind of blending and the metamorphosis and the shifting between these frequencies where you start getting really interesting sounds. And so in terms of synthesis, kind of starting to use this idea of the graphical or the light-controlled sound. Many of you might know about Daphne Oram and the Oramics machine that she was developing in the 50s and 60s. And I'll show you a quick video, but she was experimenting with kind of drawing sound using the same photoelectric cell that was used, the thalified cell that Theodore Case invented.
Workshop was concentrating somewhat on the drama side, and I wanted to concentrate on the music side. So I set up my own studio here just around 10 years ago.
I'm carrying on playing it because there's a bit where she's kind of drawing her wave shape in a minute and plugging it into the machine. But she was very interested in the kind of human and exploratory nature of kind of making music, and the way that gesture and being able to control kind of tone and modulation by hand was like a very expressive new form of computer music. So she had these kind of 35mm strips. Here we go, this is the wave shape that she would paint onto glass and sort of plug into the machine. It was this kind of idea of exploring different sounds just through complete intuition and sort of continuous exploration, like experimentation with sound. And so the film strips we saw at the beginning, they were all kind of controlling different things like pitch and amplitude and all sorts of different parameters. But you could kind of draw undulating waves that might go faster, or here we go, faster or slower, and that would kind of create these interesting sort of pitched, like vibratos and tremolo kind of effects that were all drawn by hand. And here's another example of a light-controlled synthesizer. It was invented by Merzen, and apparently his wife was quite heavily involved as well, but I can't find her name, and that's quite a classic one. So it was designed in the 30s and realized in the 50s, well, publicly kind of shared in the 50s after the death of Stalin, because designing instruments like this and using these kind of components was pretty much criminal in Russia at the time, so he had to sort of keep it very secret. Inventors inventing their own machines were all criminals at the time, or sort of pretty much criminal. So it was a system where there was a kind of a huge screen that was all painted with non-drying mastic, which is kind of like a non-drying paint. And you could scratch in your composition. So here's another example of it up here, which all of these kind of lines, the parallel lines are all chords. And underneath the mastic are these kind of very, very fast spinning discs, optical discs, which were coincidentally exactly the same size as a CD. And so they were all spinning, and there were light readers underneath. So there was lights shining through, and each of these little spinning areas on the disc was a different frequency. So when you sort of scratch through the opaque screen, it would kind of reveal these different frequencies as this reader kind of moved along. And it took me a while to sort of figure out how it was all working. There are some very good descriptions of it and videos. But the interesting thing about this was there was no scale. So it kind of encouraged this idea of like a microtonal music. And this wasn't actually a keyboard. This was just a kind of a reference. So people would know what notes were under these, but they would be able to sort of shift around and kind of pitch bend and kind of explore all of these frequencies, which gives the sound of the ANS synthesizer like a really otherworldly, spooky sound. And it was used by, if you're interested in film, Tarkovsky and Solaris and Stalker soundtracks, which is very interesting. So, this is an article that I come back to quite a lot around computer music and synthesis. So Laurie Spiegel was a composer and a musician who was exploring, she was working at Bell Labs and really interested in the sort of expansion of expression in computer music. And she kind of put out, it's kind of like a sort of a manifesto or an article around kind of new descriptions of musical transformations and control, because at the time computer music could be quite like a rigorous sort of sequenced, and a lot of kind of programming environments were very kind of rigid in what they expected you to do with rhythm and scale. So she was kind of calling for these kind of more animated approaches to making sound. And she kind of described these different sort of manipulations as transposition, reversal, rotation, all these kind of words that are quite sort of indicative of like an animation techniques or something kind of quite visible or tangible. So kind of onto more of the filmmaking side now and the animators. The people who know about optical sound might know about Norman McLaren, who was working around the same time as Daphne Oram. He was kind of working with the National Film Board of Canada from the 40s till around the 80s. And he was a kind of a really multidisciplinary animator who is exploring loads of different types of processes, from like very abstract works to really like figurative and experimental sort of darkroom processes. I'll show you some of the stuff. Oh, this isn't working. Okay, neither of these films seem to have uploaded. But basically, oh no, it's working now. It's not working on my screen. That's very strange. It's in the wrong place, so I'm just going to leave that there because that's not the one I was going to show you. But the one I was going to show you was kind of this film of two dancers, and it's a process called optical printing. So he filmed two dancers, and he would take the film strip with the dancers on and basically like print it again and again, but kind of step it back a few frames each time. So there was this kind of like a visual echo, and it's really kind of indicative of his approach to film, which was very much about this kind of metamorphosis. And this is kind of distracting, but I can't stop it. Yeah, the kind of a metamorphosis of animation, of the kind of playing with the cinematic machine and exploring how you could kind of twist it and have these kind of different visual effects. So hopefully this one will work in the right place if I press it. Is this working? Oh. No, neither of these are working, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. So in the 60s, there was a massive boom in access to film equipment. The camera companies like Bolex and Arri were rapidly expanding, and there was kind of access to these cameras in universities worldwide. They started stocking camera equipment, darkroom equipment, and then Super 8 was introduced a bit later, which kind of had a complete massive impact on sort of home movie. But Super 8 doesn't have optical sound on the camera, so mainly the 16mm film was kind of the optical sound, because it was kind of between the home movie Super 8 and the kind of Hollywood movie 35mm. 16mm sits somewhere in the middle, so it was like a perfect kind of medium to use for sort of experimental film collectives. So with the boom of cameras, there was kind of independent cooperatives and collectives just cropping up all over, like LA Rebellion in LA out of UCLA, and the London Filmmakers Co-op started to form. And so voices that had been excluded or dangerously misrepresented were able to make work that was reflective of their experience or their vision of the world. And the London Filmmakers Co-op had a really structuralist kind of experimental approach to filmmaking, which was kind of, it was examining, well, Liz Rose's work is examining the power structures of the audio and visual language of film and exploring meanings at the edges of that language. So kind of not using this figurative sort of speech or music or figurative visuals, but exploring kind of the amplification of passive, or the sort of representation of passive voices in a much more kind of screaming, synthesized, kind of effective way. I'll show you some of Dresden Dynamo, because this is the first optical sound film I ever saw that kind of made me fall in love with it. Hopefully it's going to work. So it's quite a bad sound. But she was printing, I'll turn it down a little. She was printing letraset in the darkroom onto film using blue and red gels. And she was kind of exploring sound as she went. Basically, she would sort of print one type of letraset, which is kind of like this patterned kind of stencil. She would print with one type of letraset and realize that it was kind of the sound of a middle C, and that if she used another one, that it would kind of create this like kind of chord and this, these kind of interactions between different frequencies and phasing and all sorts. But this is a very low-res video, I've realised now, but there's a much better one on Vimeo. And I really, if you ever see that there's Dresden Dynamo is being screened in a cinema, I'd really recommend seeing it projected, because it's kind of an incredible thing to see, with the shuttering, the kind of flutter of the film, and like the hearing the mechanics of the film as it plays is really amazing. So Guy Sherwin was another person who was exploring optical sound, part of the London Filmmakers Co-op. And he was reducing sound down to its constituent parts and exploring the guts of the projector. A lot of his films are about using the camera, so shooting stuff like railings and stairs and grids that would kind of fall into the soundtrack area of the film and start kind of synthesizing these pretty intense and sort of rumbling soundtracks that basically what you saw, you heard. But this one is an optical sound film called Cycles 3, which he was using like hole punches on the film to kind of create these rhythmic popping. And he had 2 projectors, so he could kind of play with this like phasing rhythms between them. I'll play a little bit and then. But the interesting stuff about this type of filmmaking is the machinery that you hear from the projector when you're kind of next to it, hearing it projected. It kind of always lines up rhythmically with what you're seeing, and also the sound of the optical sound, because if you're kind of making these sounds frame by frame, then it's you can kind of hear the shutter and the sprockets moving, and it's all in sync. So it's this idea of kind of synchrony of image and sound, done in really simple but effective ways. Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my work quite quickly. Sorry. I'll rush through these. So I do a lot of filmmaking using these kind of printing methods in the darkroom, where I'm layering one film onto another using kind of stenciling techniques. This is a very like blurry, but you can see this is a kind of a hybrid of like digital and analog techniques. This was using rotoscoping technology to make these kind of masks of hands, and then using darkroom like printing to kind of print these textural kind of moving forms inside the stencils. And I really love working in the darkroom, but I know that darkrooms are quite problematic spaces. They're quite, they're very private. You kind of need your own space. And I share mine with some other filmmakers, but a lot of my work is around designing darkroom equipment that can be taken out of the darkroom and kind of shared with other people so they can explore these same techniques, and designing those in a way that can be made in sort of maker labs, so people have access to the equipment. Kind of move on, but I want to show some of these extra bits of film. So these are all, most of this work is kind of exploiting the mistakes that happen when you work with film. There's tons of like issues that you have every time you make a film. Basically, this one I printed and I didn't have enough developer in the tank, so it was kind of half developed when I made a print. But then putting that inside the negative of the other one kind of create this like, you know, there's always things that you can use out of the mistakes and the noise from film, which is definitely kind of informing my approach to instrument design. which I'll talk about later. So this is a film with Grove. I should have said which the films are, but. So another part of my work is exploring access to synthesizers, and we have a group at Bristol Hackspace, of which there's a member here, Guy. And we're kind of exploring the idea that a lot of music technology is incredibly hard to come by, and it's like very technical, very expensive. So it's kind of creating a space where people can come and use and explore modular synths and synthesizers without having to spend loads of money and kind of get involved in quite gatekeepy communities. So we're building a co-built and co-owned modular synth system, and we're also co-designing instruments that are kind of affordable, like the Yorick here, which was designed to be sort of quite complex, but also like very sort of affordable to buy and to build. And it's a little stylophone and with a sequencer, and then we have our percussion instrument here, the Magnum. So it's kind of, the project is around accessibility to instruments. My former work as well, this is some workshops I ran with, which I can't pronounce, but it's a project with Kathy Hind and Becca Rose, who are both studio residents. And it's exploring kind of the embodied exploration of sound. So I think the reason why I'm so interested in optical sound is because it breaks the signal out into something that you can kind of see and understand without understanding the kind of terminology behind the machines. So if you're, for example, with optical sound, if you kind of have a signal that's like out of focus or a camera that's out of focus, it kind of filters the sound. You can kind of have visual trails and echoes. It's kind of exploring those ideas of like signal processing, but in a way that's like kind of embodied. And these workshops were exploring the use of kind of breaking out synthesizers into kind of different tangible controls. So this one was run at Arnolfini with Becca Rose. And we were building these like light-controlled synth masks that everyone could kind of build into whatever, put the kind of sensors wherever they liked and control them in whichever way they liked. And it was really interesting seeing people interact with them in completely different ways. And this was another one where we were creating these kind of graphite-controlled synthesizers. And what we saw was people were kind of drawing out their own tools for controlling sound. Like this was essentially like a little keyboard that this girl drew. So she was kind of creating her own, like designing her own interfaces for playing with sound. And that kind of directly relates to this idea of like a constructionist learning where we learn best through designing and building things in the world. So when you kind of design instruments, it's like you kind of empower people to find out about sound through allowing them to build their own interfaces. So I'll go through this a little. I can talk more about the design, the darkroom design, for anyone who's interested after the talk. But my work at UE is going to be about sort of designing an instrument as well as exploring sort of the optical sound framework through kind of examining artists who use optical sound and their processes over a long period of time to create optical sound soundtracks and works. I'll be designing an instrument to explore tangible interactions with sound using this framework, but digitally, so people will be able to sort of construct visual or tangible signals that will be read in the same way as optical sound will. So it's a way of kind of exploring different materials and different processes, and potentially people can build their own tools in order to sort of interact with the signal that will be visible on the instrument. And then the kind of challenge of that would be introducing like a fluency or something kind of real time, like how can you kind of introduce this idea of shifting signals or metamorphosis of pattern onto a system like this. So when you use light and shadow, you can kind of interact with signals in quite a fluid and gestural way. But it's exploring like these different kinds of frameworks and how that might be done in different ways. Thank you.
We've got about 5 minutes for questions, so if anybody's got something that they would like to ask of Jazz, please raise your hand. I'm just going to explain a little bit about this mic. It won't amplify your voice in the space, but what it does is it enables people online to be able to hear what you're saying, so if you can hold it to your mouth while you're speaking, that would be great. Emma, if there's any questions online, if you can just stick your hand up as well, that would be great. Okay. Any questions?
Thanks, Jess. I really enjoyed it. I really like the way you are privileging the analog over the digital. Because I guess in principle, everything could be done digitally.
Yeah.
But that's not the point, right? So I really like that aspect of it. But I was wondering whether you might consider the possibility of a portable music player. So instead of me creating things, which I put in front of a fixed camera, as it were, I can carry the camera with me.
Yeah, the idea of like the camera, the movable, almost like a kind of a microphone in a way. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting idea. And it's very hard to control. I think the kind of fixed interface, you know where the barriers and the margins are, but when you start taking it out of that, like Guy Sherwin was, you get a lot more kind of noise, but that's quite interesting to explore. Yeah. Thank you.
That's great. Any other questions?
Hi, Jasmine.
Hiya.
That was an awesome talk. Brilliant.
Oh, great.
I was going to ask, have you, you stated at the start you were an AV musician as well. Is there like live performances and things we can see? Is that something that can be done in physical space?
Yeah, so often with my film work, it tends to be, I do show optical sound films that because of the AV and the time, I didn't quite show you, but I can show you in a bit as well. So I do tend to screen those, but also I do sort of music videos and live visuals for things, so using projections for musicians' live visuals. And then I'm in a band on the side, but it's not really related. But yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you.
There's a question at the back over here.
That was great. I'm so happy someone's archiving all this analog sound work.
Okay.
So thank you. Cheers for doing all that. So very quickly, a couple years ago, there was a tattoo company I came across that was doing tattoos of sound waves of someone someone saying like "I love you." So it was a recording you had of a person, or like someone had gotten their dogs barking or something like that. So you got the tattoo on your body, and then there was an app, of course, that you would would read the sound waves so you could hear it.
Yeah.
And of course, from a tattooing perspective, the tattoo would degrade over time, so God knows what would happen to the sound it would make over that. But it was like, so is the future of analog sound tattoos? Do you know what I mean? Like, I was thinking about, because I was like, because that seems like such a great 19th century merger of like analog tech, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that, but it's really interesting.
You don't have to.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, it can be inspirations as well as questions. Is there any questions online, Emma? Not at the moment. Well, I have a question for you, Jazz. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about some of the communities that exist in Bristol that are doing this kind of work, and places where people can maybe access equipment for making things, if people are interested in doing that.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of darkrooms, there is a really amazing community space at St Paul's Learning Centre. They have a shared darkroom there, and they do a lot of workshops. And also Beef is one to look at, so Bristol Experimental Expanded Film, who Kathy is a member of and does lots of amazing optical sound works as well. So they have a program of workshops, and it was them that kind of got me into making films. And also Bristol Hackspace as like a place to make and sort of construct and build. There's electronics workshop there, as well as laser cutters and 3D printers and all the maker stuff. So that's another one to look at.
Amazing, thank you. Well, it's almost 2 o'clock, so we'll wrap it up there, if that's okay. But before we go, I just wanted to let you all know that it's First Friday today, which means that from 5 till 6, we'll be running our monthly social event, which usually takes place here in the studio, but today it's a special one because it's going to take place downstairs in a new space called Watershed that we're going to be opening, which you can access from the walkway at the front of the building. So we'll be showing off our plans for this kind of brand new exhibition space. Yeah, so if you go kind of down to the box office outside, it's sort of next door. Can you access it through the box office, Martin? No, you have to go outside, yeah, separate door. And there will be some free drinks, so that's quite a nice reason to come along, right? So also, if you want to stick around and hot desk today or find out more about what we do, then please come and find someone from the studio team, which is myself, Martin, Emma at the back today. There's a few of us buzzing around, and we'll be really happy to help you. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk if you have any questions. And thanks for being here today, and we'll see you all next week. Okay.